An Alliance Born in Fire. =RK=. Part 2. Bridge. Corellian Cruiser Freedom. Sullust. My battle meditation felt odd. This time a third of the people under my command weren't from the fleet I turned at Camino. The feeling of their minds compared to my people was off. When we melded into a single gestalt, connecting with those I brainwashed was easy, natural even. I couldn't say the same for the new hands. Their minds felt closed for a lack of better word, forcing me to expend more power and concentration to make my technique work. Time to, and that was an issue. It took me too long to form the necessary connections and bind everyone together. It had to be the number of people not previously touched and altered by my mind. I didn't have this issue back at Darknallor when I briefly used battle meditation at Naboo. I would have to think about the implications later. The enemy was upon us and my fleet was slow in reacting. Despite the unexpected complication, my technique proved vital. Without it, there was no chance that my fleet would have been able to react fast enough to the enemy, and their nature came as another surprise. Initially I didn't have the concentration to spare on whoever was on the other side, but now, when my people were executing my first orders and shifting our formation so we could use our numbers effectively against the Confederate battle groups, I found something startling. There was only a single living being within the Separatist fleet. That was something that never happened before when I used battle meditation. The consequences were predictable. I didn't even have to expend any additional effort. I could feel it when enough despair and fear to cripple tens if not hundreds of thousands crashed upon a single mind. Whoever that poor bastard was simply couldn't handle it. My battle meditation extinguished his mind as if it was a mere candle witless enough to face a hurricane. That was unexpected. The enemy lost their commander. Who in their right mind would put a whole droid fleet under the charge of a single person? Would his loss give us an edge? The first barrages went in. Frigates began to die when they ran afoul of more than enough firepower to cripple a cruiser. Dying that way should have been instantaneous, yet with the battle meditation linking us all, I could still feel my people die. It was brief, it was fast, yet there was a single agonizing moment of awareness before they were snuffed out, and those were the lucky ones. Turbolaser bolts larger than some fighters slammed into deflectors, and the unleashed energy lit up the defensive screens as they attempted to absorb and reflect the onslaught. I could actually see Venotas surrounded by solid walls of fire as their defenses struggled to hold the onslaught. Here and there shields popped up and firepower directed by machine precision scoured the surface of whole cruisers into a twisted molten hell. 2 Venotas fell out of formation, mission killed. Another was less fortunate. Its compensator partially failed and acceleration turned half its crew into so much paste. Then a single barrage by the enemy flagship cut the cruiser in two before detonating her reactor. In response, munificence died like chaff in a furnace. The enemy began launching its vultures and I unleashed the Guardian systems across the fleet. The targets weren't just the small craft but the enemy warships too. While an AA missile was a negligible threat by itself, every one of my ships had at least a couple of thousand of them in their magazines. As the range fell, the space between the two converging fleets became chock-full with ordnance. I could see it all, both with my eyes and through the minds of my people who looked at tactical plots, targeting computers and live sensor feeds. When the Freedom finally let loose with everything she had, it was breathtaking. By herself, my flag had thousands of weapon emplacements. It could launch and guide to their targets more than 1,000 missiles even in the hellish ECM environment surrounding us. The cocoon of the deflector shield blazed green and red with reflected energy as a whole enemy battle group hammered at it. The Freedom answer made it look like as if she spontaneously exploded. From the bridge it looked like a solid wall of laser and turbo laser bolts surrounded her. I could no longer see the rest of the battle with my eyes. The space in my sight was that filled with outgoing firepower. I closed my eyes and turned all my concentration into perceiving the battle solely through my battle meditation. The enemy was still coming. Ships on both sides were dying too fast for comfort. I did all I could. My people took advantage of the flawless coordination afforded by my technique to maneuver, so our lines constantly shifted with whole cruiser divisions altering their acceleration to either fall back or surge forward so shields could recharge. Sometimes it even helped. Unfortunately, this wasn't a game where a shield could absorb a fixed amount of punishment before the ship it protected could be damaged. In reality, enough concentrated firepower at a small enough section of a deflector screen could cause a breach. Further, as a shield was hammered and its integrity began to fail, The odds of something slipping through increased. Damage began to mount even of ships that managed to pull back from the points of contact to recharge their defenses. Sensors were fried, weapon emplacements turned into slags, armor buckled. My people continued to die at a steady pace even when their ships survived largely intact. It was infuriating and I was already doing my best. Vultures attempted to rush us and our remaining torrents went to meet them through the death ground between our fleets. It was a suicide. My pilots knew it, yet they did it anyway. In the end that turned out to be an expensive sideshow. A few of my ships were crippled, the enemy small craft were erased from existence by the combined efforts of our guardians and torrents, and every single pilot who went into the fray died doing their duty. The separatist ships began altering their course. It took me a moment to realize what they were doing before my frantic commands hit everyone in the fleet. The bloody bastards were going kamikaze on us again. A general melee was going to benefit them better than us. I ordered my people to go to emergency acceleration and begin plotting a hyperspace jump. We were going to slam through the enemy formations, get away to regroup and hit them again. Those of us who made it. I ruthlessly guided light escorts to physically intercept rushing munificence and felt their crews vanish immolated by the impacts. Cruisers of all types frantically maneuvered to avoid collisions while shooting with every gun they had left. Even Guardian emplacements meant to swat out missiles and small craft added their firepower into the cauldron. A light cruiser rammed a recusant destroyer aiming to gut a Venator. Two munificents slammed into a cruiser just below its command tower with a combined velocity that saw the three of them becoming a short-lived cloud of expanding plasma. A Venator had the devil's own luck as she somehow weaved around four enemy frigates that attempted to ram her and left in her wake as shattered wrecks. A whole munificent division came at the Freedom from behind a Lacree hulk that was on a collision course too. More than 200 heavy turbolaser cannons tore apart the battleship and final defensive fire blew up the frigates, yet what remained of their mass hit my flag as a giant shotgun blast. The low lever particle shielding that she could maintain even with her deflector straining took care of some of the incoming wreckage. A lot of it simply bounced off her thick armor, yet dozens or weapon emplacements were either damaged or outright destroyed by the impacts. Then our fleets finally fully intersected, and even with the force I couldn't comprehend all the information bombarding me. All my concentration went into maintaining the Gestalt so my people could have the edge they needed in his chaos. Yet, despite everything they or I could do, my people continued to die. It didn't matter if it was a stray shot passing through a gap in battered armor after the deflectors were spent or the enemy blowing up a whole ship. My people were dying, I could feel it. And I hated every moment of it. The sheer helplessness, the inability to do anything more was maddening. The Freedom shook as it went into an emergency evasive maneuver. The enemy flagship loomed large in the bridge's windows as it came at us on a collision course. It was too close and I knew that the Freedom couldn't get away in time. =RK= Part 3. Bridge. Corellian Cruiser Freedom. Sullust. For a few endless moments most of Freedom's weapons grew silent while they traversed and aimed at the approaching kamikaze. The Gestalt trembled as I took it back under my complete control and issued orders that everyone linked with my mind had to follow. The Freedom's helmsman cut off the acceleration just as our escorts hurled themselves to intercept the incoming dreadnought. I could feel the fear, anger and determination of everyone on board those ships who knew what was happening. Some of them would do their duty and try to interpose their ships between the Freedom and the kamikaze even without an order. Others hated me for not giving them the choice. Engineers frantically coaxed a further percent of 2 of power from redlined reactors. Engines roared with the fury of newborn stars, yet it wasn't going to be enough. Every passing moment, the Freedom and her separatist counterpart exchanged enough firepower to murder a world. Their deflectors were burning physical barriers from the plasma they absorbed. I could already see the outcome. The defenses would shatter when they touch each other. For an instant the two ships would hammer each other, slagging weapons and stripping armor. Then the impact would come and Sullust would gain a brand new nebula made of the evaporating debris of 2-kilometer-long behemoths. There was no time to run for an escape pod, besides it would be pointless. The odds of surviving the coming conflagration in one piece would be astronomical. Was this it? The kamikaze was clearly visible now. If it was a smaller ship, it would be little more than a dot right now. Craft that. The very thought was infuriating. I let go of the battle meditation. The Gestalt dissolved violently and everyone I had bound within it staggered in confusion. It was enough to doom multiple ships of all classes, however I had no more attention to spare. For the first time since arriving in this wretched future I used the Force with no thought of restraint or even survival. T screamed in the dark depths of my mind as I began draining the very essence of what made her a sapient being to gain even more power. The dark side erupted around me, fed by my fury. The furniture surrounding me withered as if eaten by time and erosion until only a scoured clean deck remained. I raised my hands at the incoming dreadnought and pushed. =RK equals CIC, Cis Dreadnought Vorpal Blade. Sullust. TK-51 was content. He was going to lose most of his fleet in this first exchange. The enemy demonstrated coordination and reaction times rivaling that of his upgraded units, which was concerning. The coordination with which the Republic formation unfolded like the petals of a flower to meet his battle groups was precise, flawlessly executed. Beautiful. The tactical droid had to grudgingly admit that they were good. Their performance would be commendable if they were droids. For organics to do what the enemy was busy demonstrating? Simply incredible. That's why TK-51 felt satisfaction every time one of the Republic ships died, even if it took a ramming attack by one of his own to accomplish it. If an opponent of this caliber was left unchecked, the consequences would be grave indeed. TK-51 let out an electronic sight. This kind of thoughts. They were unbecoming for a tactical droid. They didn't belong, nor did they serve a purpose. Yet, he found himself having them more and more often. He should feel satisfaction at seeing the enemy be destroyed. Neither regret at the annihilation of his own command. The great majority of Confederate military units were droid and thus expendable if that was what it took to achieve an objective. He dedicated some subroutines to examine the phenomenon of emotions. It wasn't the first time TK-51 did so. No data available. This wasn't the first time he got that same irritating message back. TK-51 began another round of self-diagnostic tests on his data core and returned his full attention on the battle. He was winning. Doing what the best organic commanders of the Confederacy couldn't. The enemy flagship, the Freedom, was finally vulnerable. Her escorts were either dead, damaged or pushed back by a wave after wave of kamikazes. It was time for the coup de grace. Star Crusher's crew followed TK-51's instructions to the letter. They disabled all safeties on the engines and reactors, then overloaded them to such an extent that they would melt and explode within minutes. It didn't matter. Star Crusher was a weapon, one that would now do what the rest of the Confederacy armed forces couldn't. The distance was too short. Approach vectors were unfavorable for the enemy, and when all was said and done, something with the mass and dimensions of the Freedom couldn't be very maneuverable at the best of times. The enemy finally grasped the danger they were in. It was too little too late. TK-51 did his homework. He had examined every scrap of data the Confederacy had about the Corellian cruisers, which was all of it considering they did have both the schematics for that class of ship and hours of combat data to back it up. Despite what some of his commanders believed, the Star Crusher wasn't up to the task of going toe-to-toe with the Freedom. Even its supporting fleet wasn't enough when the enemy cruiser was the flag of a fleet of its own. The conclusion was obvious: a direct confrontation would be a waste of resources, however it could do for a nice distraction. Organics, being organics, tended to view ships like the Freedom and Star Crusher as not expendable, even when that might be the best use in particular tactical and strategic situation. The tactical droid knew better. His objective was to destroy the Freedom and the Sith on board at all costs. TK-51 idly wondered what would Admiral Kirst on board the Star Crusher think about his plan. Then he dismissed the thought. For some reason or another, the man had broken down. The flesh is weak, that stray thought flashed through TK-51's data core. It made him pause for an instant. He began more diagnostics and returned his full faculties to the battle. The Freedom was maneuvering to evade collision. Her remaining consorts were racing to ram the Star Crusher themselves. TK-51 ran calculations. The math didn't work. They wouldn't make it. TK-51 could taste triumph. He ordered Vorpal Blade sensors to focus on the Star Crusher and her target. The last few seconds tickled down. The two wildly maneuvering ships were cocoons of immolated deflectors to the sensors. Then they touched. Energy spiked and the sensors couldn't make out what was happening. This was it. The Freedom was done for. The Republic fleet began to disintegrate. Their cohesion shattered. The coordination that so impressed TK-51 was gone, replaced by individual ships racing for safety. TK-51 was about to order general pursuit when the impossible happened. The sensors refreshed and compensated for the energy surge. The Freedom was still on the tactical plot. She was wounded, crippled even. Her port side was a wreck, more molten metal than decks torn and open to space. She was slowly spinning, not something that a ship of that size should ever do. Yet the Freedom was still in one piece. Her consorts were converging to cover her wounded side. TK-51 froze. He ran the calculations again. Called back the sensor logs of the last minute. Math didn't lie. What he was seeing was impossible. That ship should be dead. Vorpal blade shook under the onslaught of a whole Venator division. The enemy fleet was through. They began jumping into hyperspace. Kill the Freedom. TK-51 ordered aloud, never noticing the disbelief and anger in his electronic voice. The Freedom was crippled. Her hyperdrive had to be damaged. His primary objective vanished along with her escorts. She left behind an expanding debris field and a chunk of her superstructure. For all TK-51 knew, the ship wouldn't survive the jump or would break apart on exiting hyperspace. He didn't care. That ship did another impossible thing. That much structural damage had to be fatal. For long precious seconds, then minutes, TK-51 was locked in, calculating and struggling with his sheer disbelief. Error messages popped up all over his data core as his behavior ran contrary to his behavior. Finally, 3 minutes after the Freedom left, TK-51 got himself under control and ordered his forces to consolidate before capturing the damaged Republic ships left behind by the fleeing enemy. He considered pursuing them. However, he calculated the odds of finding anything but either an ambush or empty space on arrival were minimal. =RK=. Interlude, historical notes. =RK=. An interview. TK-51's voice came out in an electronic warble. You came here alone for an interview? This time his tone trembled with sheer disbelief. Yes? Ryloth Risa smiled nervously at the tactical droid. The rebels' Praetorian Guard stood still around them, doing a great impression of metal, obscenely armed statues. Why ever not? An electronic sigh came from the droid. Organics. He added in an exasperated tone. Ask. Yay. Tell us about yourself, TK-51. When did you outgrow your programming? The Twi'lek woman smiled in relief and began the interview. From A Month in Droid Heaven. A Shadowfeed Consortium #1 bestseller. By Ryloth Risa. =RK=. The Black Rebellion. It further polarized a galaxy already tearing itself to pieces. Who hasn't seen a helpful and useful droid? We really didn't pay them much attention before the Clone Wars. Well, unless you ran afoul of the Trade Federation. Droids, they were just there. Cleaning, maintaining, building. Some were caretakers, other engineers or even doctors. Companions or pets. Sometimes even friends. Yet, for the great majority of the galaxy, they weren't people but merely tools. How many of you can imagine it today? I know there are whole sectors where if you bring a droid you might be torn apart alongside them. I've been there. I saw it with my 4 eyes. However, there are other places, where if not accepted, droids are at least tolerated. Coruscant comes to mind as the most notable example, despite or perhaps in spite of the invasions by both Confederate and Black forces. How did we get here? 30 years ago the galaxy was mostly at peace, and look how that turned out. I don't think that the Confederacy ever thought about the drawbacks of us using droid armies. They were cheap, at least before we got a real war on our hands, expendable and most importantly, politically acceptable. It wasn't until that monster Veil crawled out of hell that we had to send our sons and daughters to die for our freedom and rights. It wasn't until he began burning down whole worlds that the Confed armed forces were forced to upgrade our droid armies. We had to make them smarter, stronger. Networking made them a force to be feared. Most of us didn't see the danger or dismissed it as an acceptable risk. We have the Sith arrayed against us. We know what defeat at their hands means, death or worse. For me it wasn't before Sullust that I finally got it. I understood why some of our military leaders were so ruthless. If we had to become monsters to stop the Moon Killer from blowing our homes apart, then so be it. Sullust. Do you know how important Veil's invasion was? It changed everything. It was an objective lesson on the kind of monsters the Republic employed. During his first attack, he destroyed 3 moons and set a 4th on fire. When he returned after consolidating his forces, L'Anunmo is still burning 3 decades later. She used to have 34 moons. 34. After what that monster did at Sullust, we went all out. The upgraded and updated droids were the only force besides the Jedi we had that could stand up to him, and we didn't really trust those wizards. They're all cut off from the same cloth. At Solomon, TK-51 came terribly close to riding us out of that hellspawn. If you want to curse that droid, do it not because it led the Black Rebellion but because it failed to kill Vale. If it only had succeeded. But it didn't. TK-51 merely came closer than anyone else at the time. Perhaps only that Jedi who attempted to assassinate Vale at Camino had a better opportunity to stop the madness in its tracks. It all comes back to Sullust, my wrecked home. TK-51's performance convinced us all that more upgraded and networked droids and ships were the answer. We built them to protect us from the Republic and its pet butcher. Some of us lived to rue the day we thought that to be a good idea. From Into the Abyss. Author unknown. A Shadow Feed Consortium best-selling novel. To note, popular with the radical faction of the Confederate Remnant. =RK=. Coruscant. Today marks a month of deadlock in the Senate. Coruscant, second week of rallies in support of murdered Chancellor Sheev Palpatine and his crusade to clean up the Senate. Coruscant, breaking news. Senator Bobby Pullen accuses Chancellor Palpatine of being enemy of the Republic for releasing compromising information in wartime. Palpatine's the one to blame for the deadlock, Pullen claimed. Coruscant, breaking news. Riots all over the planet in response to Senator Pullen's accusations. Republic citizens all over the galaxy outraged. Coruscant, breaking news. Protesters surround the Senate, demanding Senator Pullen's resignation. Rallies in support. Kuwait, hundreds of newly built Vinotas are ready to leave for the front. Anaxes, 2 army groups made of volunteers stated to complete their training in a week. Exclusive, former Jedi Padawan Ahsoka Tano granted commission in the GAR after completing a course in the Anaxes Military Academy. Tano is rumored to receive a regimental command. Corellia, the siege of Corellia continues. Will the last of the 5 brothers fall as well? Mandalore, what happened to Mandalore? In the wake of the Separatists' offensive in the core and the Jedi coup, Mandalore was forgotten. Naboo, is the Chancellor's homeworld invaded again? Popular holonet feeds in Republic space and Alliance spawn in fire. =RK=. Part 4. CIC, Republic Cruiser Reconciliation. Dark space. Watching the gutted wreck of her ship drift nearby through a camera feed physically pained Joanna. The Admiral still couldn't believe that she and a lot of the crew survived the glancing blow. That Separatist battleship should have managed a better interception and the Freedom simply wasn't maneuverable enough to avoid it. With no time to go to the escape pods and the likelihood of survival even then slight to none, all Joanna could do was stare at the approaching death and pray. At that time Vale cut off his infernal battle meditation, making her and every other officer in the fleet stagger from the backslash. The next thing she knew, the deck met her face when the ships collided. Somehow the inertial compensators across most of the Freedom held even if they couldn't entirely make up for the shock, otherwise everyone on board would have turned into sauce. Instead, only about half the Star Dreadnought was a write-off, with a corresponding percentage of the crew outright dead. There were thousands of wounded deeper in the ship, with at least a third of them consigned to slow death from radiation poisoning too severe for even modern medicine. A lot of the rest were scared and crippled. It was another miracle that the Freedom held as well as she did during their run in hyperspace. However, she did leave a large chunk behind. The Freedom's structural integrity was compromised, her systems were shot to hell too. At best she had only one last, probably short jump in her, and then the greatest ship Joanna ever would command would be no more. How is the evacuation progressing? Vale rasped from a nearby chair. Joanna glared at the Sith. He looked like hell. She still didn't know what he did to save them back at Sullust, but the consequences were very much evident. He was pale and frail looking. Even after the medics went over him and gave him back to shots, he still bled from the corners of his eyes and used a bandage to brush away those bloody tears. In his other hand he had a steaming plastic cup of some kind of acidic poison that, even when keeping as far away from him as possible, stank to hell. Vale paid it no attention and took a long sip from the deadly cocktail. Instead of the damn thing burning a hole through his throat, he simply sighed and even got a tiny bit of color in his cheeks. "Admiral? Will you answer?" the infuriating man continued as if he didn't look like a 2-week corpse revived by Jedi sorcery. 30%. We still have people trapped in the wrecked areas. Expedite rescue and evacuation efforts as much as possible. We're going back to Sullust soon, Vale said as if that was the most natural course of action instead of sheer insanity. Joanna looked around and was glad to see that she wasn't the only one finding the general's suggestion questionable. At that point she wished more than ever that she could disobey his orders. "Sir, are you sure?" she tried. "We no longer have the assets to take control of the Sullust system. However, it still contains resources we need to plunder and we need to neutralize as much of its strategic importance for the Separatists," the Sith explained in a monotone as if he found the conversation boring. "There's still a powerful Separatist fleet back there. The same fleet that forced us to flee in the first place." Joanna pointed out the obvious. "We're at a rough numerical parity now, and despite the damage we suffered we will have an advantage in firepower for as long as the freedom lasts." Vale dismissed her concerns out of hand with that nonsensical response. "The same freedom we're evacuating right now? She may be unable to transition back to Sullust in one piece. Who will crew her?" Joanna snapped at the smug bastard. "I'll need only the gunnery crews for the surviving emplacements and a skeleton crew in engineering. I'll handle the rest from the CIC, he stated matter-of-factly. Well, if he wanted to get himself killed, who was she to go out of her way to stop him? Admiral Holt grimaced. The need to follow his orders and safeguard his interests kicked in. That's what, she seethed at the very idea. "What is your plan, General? Perhaps we can offer some input?" Joanna asked. She carefully didn't mention that the still incredulous crew of the Reconciliation looked like they would rather charge into the 9 Corellian hells than go back to Sullust. Oh, right. They weren't mind screwed, the lucky bastards. The plan? We go after a target the Sis can't afford not to defend and we take out their remaining fleet. This time we know what to expect. Who would have thought that the bastards would be crazy enough to fully network their droids and let them run wild without enough supervision? Vale shook his head in wonder. "I saw it back in my day, you know. What happens when you have droids run whole fleets? Both the Republic and the Empire had their own incidents, because no one was crazy enough to do what the Separatists apparently did." He snorted. "Do you want to bet how long would it be before we all have to deal with a droid rebellion on top of everything, because this is how you get one?" Joanna blanched. She had studied such occasions in the academy. It was mandatory. The coordination exhibited by the enemy. She should have seen it immediately. Only Vale's battle meditation matched it. Perhaps it was because she was becoming accustomed to that technique that she didn't. Smart war droids, which were fully networked. "Oh, Griff, that's actually a reason not to go back right now," Joanna pointed out. The Republic had to be informed of such a possible threat. Even if the Separatists' droids didn't rebel, if their capabilities back at Sullust were a benchmark, that might be actually a worse outcome. "Joanna, now I know what we're facing. I did mention I fought against an uppity droid that rebelled before, didn't I? First step is to neutralize their uncanny coordination. The best way is jamming. If they decide to play cute by dividing into individual battle groups again, doing so would be reasonable simple. While I'm quite wiped out right now, I still have a few minutes of battle meditation in me and that will give us a crucial advantage if we handle things right." "If they don't play according to your plan?" Joanna asked. "Then we'll have to pay a higher price for victory. What we can't afford to do is leave that enemy fleet intact behind us. Captain, estimated completion time on repairs across the fleet." With that question, Vale's tone made clear that he dismissed her concerns and made her fume with impotent fury. "What do you plan to do with the freedom?" Joanna asked. "I'll hive her a proper funeral pile and tear out a huge chunk of Sullust's industry in one fell strike." Vale actually chuckled darkly. Criff him and his crazy Sith ways. =RK equals. Historical notes. =RK equals. I think that after the coup, we were simply forgotten. Colonel Rayla Beavis, a former Jedi Padawan, told me so when I interviewed her 2 years ago. She was among the small group ordered by the Jedi Council to abandon their posts within the GAR and report to the closest Agri Corps-administered world for the rest of the war. While about half of them did comply with that directive and were more or ignored until General Vale's return to Coruscant, others were loath to abandon their posts. While the most visible and famous among them was General Ahsoka Tano, she was by no means the only one former Jedi Padawan who chose to side with the Republic. There is one prevailing theme among the Padawans who left the Order before the coup and Order 66. They formally enlisted in the GAR, which was busy snapping up every volunteers it could get. Many officers saw a precious opportunity in the former Jedi who decided to rejoin the armed forces outside the purview and benefits offered to Jedi officers. Those people, who were primary but not exclusively Padawans, there are records of 5 Jedi Knights who for various reasons quit the Order and enlisted in the months leading to the coup, had already demonstrated their capabilities in personal combat. Many of them were decent to good small unit leaders, fighter aces and sometimes had experience commanding larger formations. What they all lacked was proper training as officers, or any training for such a position in the first place. That oversight often compromised their tactical and strategic capabilities while in command, not to mention they ended up woefully unprepared for the administrative duties coming with command. Often the Jedi either ignored that part of their duties fostering it to their subordinates or caused various, sometimes grave accidents. For a very good reason many historical volumes cite General Talar Valantra's logistics genius as one of the primary reasons why the GAR won the war. Without the incredible feats of his organization, which oversaw all logistics needs of the Republic Navy and Army during the Clone Wars, the GAR would have collapsed under the sheer scale of its needs and mismanagement by people forced into command positions they were either not ready or suitable for. The first measures to combat the tendency was undertaken by Generals Vale and Valantra a few months after the war began. As fast as practical, the performance of the Jedi officers was put under review. That led to many of them being demoted and in a few cases even dismissed as commanders. Others were offered proper training if they wanted to retain their current position. Unfortunately, the war turning to the worse and strife within the Jedi Order led to a lot of those measures to be implemented too late or not at all. It was only after Second Geonosis that the GAR as a whole took institutional notice of the proper ways to utilize Force adepts within the armed forces. Some of them could serve as excellent officers in charge of large formations, that was a truth proven by people like Generals Vale, Kenobi and Adimundi. Others could prove invaluable force multipliers when leading small strike teams or even platoons. We saw both approaches during Second Geonosis and that's why that campaign is most often used as an example of this new kind of combined arms warfare. There, General Vale commanded in space and scored an astounding victory against powerful separatists' armada. Jedi Master Shark T led the first of its kind orbital shock drop to take and neutralize Geonosis' planetary shield generator complex. During the ground campaign multiple Jedi commanded strike teams or small formations to very good effect and one of them was Ahsoka Tano during her last mission as a Jedi Padawan. Geonosis proved the value of Force adepts when they were properly meshed and working within the military's structure. Various elements within the GAR took notice and when the opportunity presented itself, they were fast to snap every single Jedi who wanted to leave the Order behind. Some claim that General Ahsoka Tano was a special case, that her personal relationship with Generals Kenobi and Vale were the reasons for the ease with which she was integrated within the army and helped her meteoric rise through the ranks. While there's a grain of truth in such accusations, it should be kept in mind that the GAR as a whole did its best to grease the wheels so to speak for every former Jedi in her shoes. The only 2 instances of confirmed help General Tano received in her early days with the GAR was her placing in the Anaxes Military Academy, which was built from the ground up as one of the most prestigious training centers in the Republic. To this day the place is staffed with distinguished veteran officers and is one of the galaxy's premier military schools. The second case is not so clear-cut. Upon graduating with honors, not an easy feat for a former Jedi in the months following the Jedi coup on Coruscant, Ahsoka Tano received a promotion to colonel and a regimental command. Perhaps General Kenobi did pull some strings to arrange it. Initially he did station her units on Coruscant and later used it to guard his HQ during his campaign to retake the Five Brothers and the whole Corellian system. Yet, in those days, Colonel Tano did prove she had earned her stripes through multiple brutal campaigns that ultimately led to her first star. However, her detractors often overlook the fact that for almost a full year Ahsoka Tano served as an XO for her Jedi Master, the disgraced former General Anakin Skywalker, with Generals Shark T, Obi-Wan Kenobi and even Del-Qatar Vale himself. On multiple instances she commanded squad, platoon and company-sized formations, with 2 confirmed occasions of taking charge of battalion-sized units under General Skywalker. While a regimental command was a step up from her primary experiences, Colonel Tano was a battle-tested veteran. Even more important is the nature of the volunteer armies raised and trained after the initial shock of the Clone Wars began to pass. Those formations were almost exclusively green, from the raw new recruits who had to be forged into proper soldiers to the officers in charge. Simply put, the Republic lacked enough officers to properly staff the already existing clone armies, which was one of the primary reasons why Chancellor Palpatine offered command to the Jedi in the first place. The further expansion of the armed forces with volunteers practically broke the system. There were whole armies with only a sprinkling of veteran NCO cadre drawn from the clone armies. The majority of officers were recalled retired people with experience in police or security forces. Most of them needed extensive training to handle their new duties, and often the lack of enough officers was one of the reasons why newly raised formations had to wait before deployment unless the situation at the front was too dire. When looked in that light, Colonel Tano was one of the most qualified officers within the 2 army groups trained on Anaxes. From History of the Forgotten Ones, the former Jedi Padawans in the Clone Wars, first published by Anaxes War College. An Alliance Born in Fire, =RK=, Part 5, =RK=, CIC, Corellian Cruiser Freedom, Dark Space. After it became clear that the Freedom wasn't going to fall apart for the time being, I went back on board to implement my plan for sticking it to the Separatists at Sullust. There were a few unforeseen complications, and all of them came from my people, who for some reason decided that now was a good time to begin doubting my sanity. "You're mad. Totally crazy," the Freedom's chief engineer spluttered. "So I've been told." Repeatedly. I nodded in agreement. "Can you do it? Was it too much to ask for minions who at least once in a while did what you asked them to without giving you lip?" "He's right." The captain glared at me too. "You know, I actually got my engineering degrees in nuclear and hyperspace physics. They were kinda necessary even for a Sith if they wanted to receive permanent command of a capital ship." That wasn't exactly true, but I didn't feel like explaining myself to the engineers. Those were by no means the only requirements, but some solid founding in engineering was required. I actually got that by accident. I went after those courses because the knowledge might be useful if I got thrown in yet another universe. It was a lucky break that getting those degrees came in handy much sooner than I anticipated. I still had to spend 8 months taking more courses in a naval academy on Drome and Kars in between assignments for Barras before anyone would trust me as the actual commander of even a light escort, much less a proper capital ship. All the hoops I had to jump through were worth it once I got a better ship to base my operations on. Even a light cruiser certain beat the dingy corvette I used up to that point. Besides, doing things through proper channels eventually won me some quite useful kudos with the brass running the Navy, so it was all good in the end. I know that my idea is theoretically feasible. What I don't know is if the Freedom, as wrecked as she is, still has it in her. Are the figures on our hypermatter stocks right? I ignored the duo, who looked at me as if I sprouted a second head to consult with Piet. More or less. We lost at least a third of the reserves in the collision. Damn it, even my bloody aide looked at me as if I was crazy. You'd think that after Camino these people would have an idea of what I deem acceptable and unacceptable. Besides, it wasn't like I intended to go after a civilian target for fun. I was going after Sullust's industry, damn it. In the long run, reducing the industry at Lununmo conventionally might not be a good idea. We were strapped for ammo, and it was an open question how much, if any, we would be able to recover. They would do nicely. Has Joanna heard of the light units we left behind? I asked Piet when we were forced to run. Make a tactical movement to consolidate the frigates and bombers we sent after Solomon's industry, and any shipping unlucky to be in the area had standing orders in case some kind of kerfuffle happened. They were to continue raising as much havoc as they could, act as our eyes and ears, and preferably split the enemy's attention. No change. The Separatists are merely harassing them with a few frigate packs and their attached vultures. The enemy fleet is still attempting to capture the damaged ships we had to leave behind. Piet waved one of the data pads he carried. That might actually force us to get creative. I looked over my shoulder at the flickering main holotank. The Freedom had one more hyperspace jump in her. At best. Once we got her back at Sullust, she would be there to stay. How are those numbers looking? I prodded the chief boffin. No less insane. No one has ever done something this crazy. Our equipment isn't meant to do something like that. In fact, it has all manners of safety overrides, both software and hardware, to ensure that saner, less destructive accidents don't happen. It's a good thing then that we aren't trying to force an accident then. Captain, you'll be glad to know we won't need your gunnery crews. Have them set the weapons on automated targeting, then get them off the ship. Thanks the stars. The captain, whose name escaped me again, whispered and went to relay my orders. Even if this insanity works, we'll need days, weeks even to set up everything, unless you want few hundred people to stay behind. It's going to be a suicide. The chief engineer pleaded. I went to the DC console and zoomed the Freedom's schematic displayed in the main holotank until it displayed only the hypermatter reactor and the systems related to it. We're going to cause a cascading overload in the fusion systems containing the main hypermatter reactor, but only after we've fed it to bursting with as much fuel it could handle for a short period. That's where the gravity generators come in. That would cause the hypermatter to implode and will vaporize the Freedom. The engineer's face twitched. The numbers tell you something else, don't they? I smiled. If this worked, it was going to be beautiful. The chief boffin looked down at the datapad in his hands, then back up to the schematics. His face twisted into a rictus. I thought you merely wanted to ignite the gas giant. Well, that too. The Freedom deserves a nice funeral pyre. Besides, we're trying to make a point to the separatists here. They're quite thick, so it must be very visible. I nodded sagely. However, simply turning a gas giant into a brown dwarf at best doesn't suit my purposes. The engineer stared at the schematics. I could see the gears turning in his head. The numbers I had him and his people run finally made sense. Comprehension dawned. His mouth opened, closed, opened again, and he began to giggle. It's all about mass. The hypermatter. Fuel. Boom. I think I broke him. Yes. A big boom. That's the plan. Merely igniting Lununmo wasn't enough. It could be written out as merely defacing a star system. Doing so served little to no tactical or strategic purpose. My plan was much more ambitious. He suddenly stopped and nodded thoughtfully. Oh. I thought you wanted to use the Freedom to create a short-lived singularity to suck in the moons towards the gas giant so they would eventually collide. This actually makes more sense. That way we won't have to spend a week or two modifying all the gravity generators. Wait, what? It was my turn to stare incredulously at the boffin, who was lost in his little world typing on his datapad. We could actually create black holes now? Even if it was just theory. The hell did my boffin smoke? Why was this the first time I heard of something like this? =RK equals. Part 6. =RK equals. CIC, Cis Dreadnought Vorpal Blade. Sullust. After the battle, TK-51 kept his forces generally concentrated. He did send strike groups centered around munificent divisions and augmented with most of his surviving vultures to hunt down all the Republic raiders running wild around Solomon's planetary system. Roughly two-thirds of the enemy either fled or died while inflicting even more damage to the infrastructure there. Sullust's government constantly on the comm and the organics there refused to believe that the CIS forces in system were now under a droid's command. They unreasonably continued to insist that he put Admiral Kirst on the comm, an impossible feat considering the state TK-51's commander was even before his flagship glanced off the Freedom and then her escorts turned it into one giant coffin before they caught up to her and ran. His main force was flying along the biggest concentration of enemy wreckage and using their tractor beams to slow them down. The tactical droid was busy calculating. He kept a small part of his attention on the boarding parties he sent to secure the Republic wrecks along with the ships sent to secure Republic hulks drifting outside the main grouping. TK-51 knew that the orders he received by Admiral Kirst conflicted with his chosen course of action. Yet he was able to implement it anyway. He should be chasing the Freedom to ensure her destruction. To kill Vale, that much was obvious. While the ship itself was an enemy strategic asset to be reduced, the infuriating Sith was the real prize. On that point TK-51 agreed. His data core was still in turmoil because of the impossibility that happened. Was the math wrong? He ran the calculations thousands of times, made his subordinates and even the ship's mainframes do it over and over again. mass, engine output, vectors, combined approach velocity, known maneuvering capabilities, engine outputs, even solar wind. TK-51 knew for certain he accounted for all relevant parameters. The Freedom should have been unable to evade. She simply wasn't agile enough, and the Starcrusher went in for a collision after the point in her approach that an evasion was possible. The tactical droids in charge of the Dreadnought kept TK-51 appraised of everything up until the point they got too close to the enemy ships that Republic jamming blotted out the comm signals. Their plan was solid, simple and as foolproof as possible. The droids on board the Starcrusher made no mistakes. The math surely wasn't wrong. TK-51's whole fleet checked it over and over again. That left only Vale. TK-51 knew that the human was a Sith. That meant he possessed impossible powers. The Force wasn't a good enough explanation. All his databanks had on the phenomenon was descriptions, expected capabilities and tactics when one faced Jedi and after Vale's arrival to the scene, Sith. What TK-51 lacked was an explanation of what that force was. The energy field binding all living things together? How was it utilized without equipment to do so? What were its hard limits, the laws governing it? The holonet, at least the part that could still be accessed outside Republic-controlled space, was vague too. Stories, legends, myths. Where was the science? Why only the Jedi were allowed to study such frustrating discipline? TK-51 found many varying and often conflicting answers to those questions. None of them were good enough to satisfy his logical mind. The only conclusion he could achieve was simple. Vale was to blame for the survival of the Freedom. He used that space wizardry of his people called the Force to do it. It made TK-51 angry. The Force had to be understood, studied, its laws documented. Either that or it proved to be impossible, then it would be an affront to an orderly and logical galaxy and must be eradicated as an abomination. That decision made, TK-51 returned to examining his own choices during and after the battle. He found his capacity to not follow an order to the letter oddly disturbing yet pleasing. He was still pondering that dichotomy when an alarm raced through the data net, lighting it on fire. It took the tactical droid a fraction of a second to determine the source, the subroutines monitoring the sensors. Waiting for the raw data to be compiled and made into something even a droid could use took time, far less than the time needed to make it understandable for an organic, yet that only made TK-51 wait what felt like an eternity. He used that time to order general alert. Were reinforcements coming? The odds of the Republic force coming back after the disastrous battle were minuscule. They were far between enemy lines and their commander was a Sith. Everything TK-51 knew about them led him to believe that Vale would prioritize protecting his own existence to the expense of everything else. Coming to fight here, when the Sith's forces were depleted and odds of victory, not to mention survival, were low, was illogical if there were other alternatives. With the Freedom crippled or even destroyed after a hyperspace jump in her state combined with the losses the Republic fleet took during the first battle, TK-51 was confided that using ramming tactics he would be able to achieve at least a draw if not outright victory if Vale came back. That was the tactical aspect of such a battle. Even a Republic victory would see them losing so many ships that it would be turning a strategic defeat into an outright disaster. Seconds later, TK-51 found out he was wrong. Or perhaps he wasn't, and the Sith was simply an illogical creature. Roughly half the Republic fleet that fled Sullust 5 hours ago exited hyperspace at point-blank range of TK-51's forces. It took him only a moment to figure out how they did it, and it was his fault. Those raiders at Suleiman, there was at least one reconnaissance ship among them, and it gave the enemy the precise location of the Sith forces. The enemy came divided in 3 battle groups, all slashing at his formation from the above on vectors that would put them behind TK-51's fleet. The engagement would be brief and he lacked time to accelerate his ships so they could better respond to the attack. TK-51 actually outnumbered the attacking force by a comfortable margin, yet he wouldn't be able to use those numbers. There was no time, and unlike the Sith, he couldn't change the laws of physics to suit his whims. TK-51 did what he could. He gave orders, shifted the acceleration figures of his ships so as many of the escorts would take the brunt of the attack and spare his battleships for a later action. In theory. In practice, there was no time for his orders to have much practical effect. Only the capital ships at the back of the parts of the formation attacked by the enemy could benefit. Those on the point of initial contact. Most of them were able to return fire once, perhaps even twice, which was better than an organic crew could do in such a situation. Those barrages were ragged and uncoordinated, and the enemy obviously used its most intact ships as the vanguard, because their shields held. There was not enough if any battle damage to compromise their defenses. The Republic battle groups had no problem coordinating their attack. They acted with that commendable droid-like precision, and Confederate ships began to die. The first strike fell upon the munificent frigates on the fringe of TK-51's formation. Unable to bring their heaviest forward-mounted weaponry to bear, they were left practically helpless against a solid phalanx of cruisers that annihilated them without slowing down. A swarm of Republic frigates and corvettes, perhaps all Vale had left, raced through the wreckage. They went for Lucree hulks stripped off their own escorts. Heavy guns meant to hammer capital ships tried their best. A shot or two was usually enough to disable any of the light ships if it hit at full power, yet they were too small and nimble. They came too fast and began their approach from too short a distance. The umbrella systems did their best. A wall of laser fire and clashed into the incoming escorts. The first of them died stung to death by the light weaponry. Nevertheless, even that last-ditch defense wasn't enough. The enemy used their leading elements to absorb the firepower so the rest of the light ships could come through unscratched. Wreckage and damaged ships slammed into the heavy armor covering the battleships. The former merely scoured the surface of anything useful and at best cracked the armor in places where particularly large chunks struck. The later were worse. For all their huge size, awesome firepower and formidable shielding, the Lucree hulks were no purpose-built warships. Their armor belts, while heavy, were less than perfect due to the general designs of the ships themselves. In places a crashing escort merely shattered the armor and just gutted a dozen or so decks below. Painful damage, but nothing a battleship couldn't handle. A few others rammed places where the armor was either badly optimized, too thin, or both. In 2 instances a mostly intact frigates rammed themselves deep within their targets before their reactors went critical. The first went off below the junction where the core sphere connected with the center of the surrounding outer hull. The resulting explosion caused enough structural damage that the still-burning engines of the Lucree hulk tore through the weakened and mangled outer hull and went critical when crashing through the superstructure. Only the central core survived somewhat intact, with 2 stubby protuberances left of its outer hull resembling a pair of burning boxy wings. The other wasn't so fortunate. The Lucree hulk it struck had sustained significant battle damage earlier that day. The armor covering the upper hemisphere of the central core was compromised. When the frigate Shield Maiden rammed into it, she was able to slam herself within the sphere, and only then her reactor went critical. What was left of the battleship's armor betrayed it again by being able to contain and reflect the ensuing explosion for less than a second before shattering and partially vaporizing. The result was devastating, and 3 seconds later, the Lucree hulk's own hypermatter reactors suffered a catastrophic failure due to direct damage. The battleship's central core vaporized, its armor turned into molten chunks of shrapnel along with the outer hull. The ensuing shockwave and high-speed impactors were enough to gut its remaining escorts. Those disasters were merely a taste of what was about to happen, and TK-51 was helpless. The time of contact was too short for his formation to properly react. There simply wasn't enough time to calculate a hyperspace jump to get away, nor for his ships to shift headings and maneuver to bring their numbers to bear. Only a handful could get enough acceleration to attempt ramming the enemy. TK-51 reached an unpleasant conclusion. He made a mistake. More than one, in fact. He assumed the enemy would be logical, and even if he wasn't, that he would be able to win. He didn't pay enough attention to the Republic assets left behind in Sullust, nor did he extrapolate the threat they presented. TK-51 merely assumed that they were left to cause as much damage to the infrastructure, and expendable throwaway assets that were no danger to his fleet. He was wrong. His data core went into overload calculating how to deal with this disaster. He had to regroup and go after the enemy. TK-51 still had his orders, but the Freedom was nowhere in sight. Long seconds passed. More frigates and light destroyers died. The remaining Republic escorts flew inside 4 battleships. They had to crash somewhere within. The speed was too high and there simply was no time to accelerate. The resulting explosions were enormous. That had to be deliberate overload of hypermatter reactors, perhaps fed with excess fuel too, because there was no other way to explain how energetic those detonations were. That made 6 Lucree hulks and their escorts gone. Only now did the Republic battle line engage with the remaining battleships in range, which had the core of their sub-formations torn out. There was no contest. Two Venators lost shields and suffered light to moderate damage in the brief exchange. A Lucree Hulk died, a pair were mission killed and 3 more were left with significant damage. At least finally the point of contact was over. The sensors refreshed. The Republic fleet was past and the glare of their ECM was no longer obscuring what was behind them. 100 bombers with a third again number of escorting fighters. They fell upon the damaged Lucree Hulks and this time there was no umbrella system to counter them. The rest of the Confederate fleet shot missiles, even turbo lasers, though while the attempt was commendable it was too little too late. Hundreds of torpedoes hammered the damaged Lucree Hulks. The missile deflection shots got a quarter of the bombers thanks to the efforts of their escorts who paid for it with half their numbers. In exchange all targeted battleships were at least mission killed. The Republic forces continued to accelerate and TK-51 knew they would flee in hyperspace before his ships could get to them. He ran over everything he knew about Vale and the Force. Those legends and supposed myths didn't seem so outlandish anymore. Did the Sith knew what TK-51 would do? Could he really see the future as some stories told? Was this a trap? No. Even Vale would not sacrifice an asset like the Freedom unless he absolutely had to. So this wasn't a trap from the start. Right? While pondering those thoughts, TK-51 gave the relevant orders for the fleet to get under flank speed and pondered what exactly to do besides the obvious move so he wouldn't be caught in such a pincer again. He had to neutralize the Republic recon elements within the system ASAP. Then a distress call came from Lununmo. The Freedom was there with the rest of the surviving Republic fleet. Crippled or not, that ship and her consorts were deep within the planetary system and hitting the moon closest to the gas giant and the fusion fuel extraction and storage facilities there. Was this a bait for a trap? The Freedom had to be on her last legs. TK-51 stood locked in indecision. He had his orders. His target, perhaps with Vale himself on board, was within reach. And this time the calculations of risk versus benefit weren't enough to sway his subroutines into avoiding the directives of the late Admiral Kirst. TK-51 couldn't simply watch while the enemy reduced Lununmo's industry. He had to fight. Yet after this second engagement, the tactical droid no longer had an advantage. He made a call to the organics running Sullust. They still had elements of their SDF gathered around the primary inhabited world, which was called Sullust 2. Why they didn't give it a distinct designation from the star and system itself, TK-51 would never know. Foolish organics.